All right. Here we are. What episode number is this, Mike?
We are on episode 10. Can you believe it?
I can. Can.
And we've been getting a lot of feedback on the podcast. And one of the main comments, do you know what that is?
Tell me.
They say they want to hear a whole lot more Mike on the podcast. It's pretty dominated by Rick.
I think that's what they call fake news.
You don't believe me?
I don't know. Is that true?
Dr. Ho, do you believe me?
Not sure what to believe at
You're
this
not going to
point.
get between us. No, that is incorrect. No one is asking for more Mike.
Oh, I'm asking for more, Mike.
All right. Well, why don't we get started and you can get a little bit of Mike.
All right.
Let's go.
Let's roll.
Risk. The final frontier. These are the stories of the Axon enterprise. Our mission to protect life, to seek amazing people, and live epic tales. Come, let us boldly go.
Welcome to episode 10 of Boldly Go. We're joined by a man who literally bridges the gap between the trauma room and the tactical stack. Dr. Jeffrey Ho earned his medical degree from Loma Linda, polished his emergency medicine skills in Hennepin County, Minnesota, and teaches the next generation as a professor at the University of Minnesota. He's board certified. He's a longtime examiner for the American Board of Emergency Medicine and a fellow of the American College of Emergency Physicians. But Dr. Ho doesn't just practice and study medicine. He's a sworn medical director in Minnesota. He's run with SWAT, directed multiple EMS services, and spent 9 years in the military reserves. Internationally, Dr. Ho is the go-to expert on non-lethal tech and high-stress physiology. If you've ever wondered, and we're going to talk about this on today's podcast, what really happens to the human body when volts, beanbags, or sheer adrenaline get involved, this is your guy. Dr. Jeff Ho, welcome to Boldly Go.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here. Appreciate the invitation.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. It's hard to believe how fast the time has flown.
It has been.
When did we first meet again?
That would be in the fall of 2003. It's been over 2 decades now.
Yeah, wow. So a little bit of background. When we first got started, we worked with this, our medical director then was this man named Dr. Robert Strapacker out of University of Nebraska. And he led some of our early studies. We had done thousands of volunteers, but it was more informal. We were really focusing on ventricular fibrillation, which if that happens, you'll know because people collapse. But as the business began to expand and tasers were becoming more widespread, there was a critique that we didn't have more rigorous analytics on human subjects, not just recording they'd been hit and that they weren't injured, but actually gathering more scientific data. And that's how we came to meet Dr. Ho, who was at the Hennepin County Medical Center, had a unique background of both also being a police officer. And what was our first study? I remember when we first got together and we said, hey, we'd like to have an independent, researcher to help set up what else should we be instrumenting besides just looking at whether or not somebody collapses after being hit with a taser?
Yeah, so by my memory, it was in 2004 when we really just got together. I was very new at sort of prospective studies, if you will. Looking at the data or the lack of at the time, we really wanted to understand what the effect of a taser device was on the human body. And so it was pretty simplistic when I look back on it now compared to what we've done. But we literally consented volunteers. We measured every physiologic parameter we could think of before while they were just being consented for the study. So we would check things like vital signs, draw resting blood, biosamples, EKGs, things like that. We then simply exposed them to standard 5-second exposure from a TASER X26. And then we would check their blood work and EKGs and all of their vital signs immediately after, and then for certain periods after, all the way out to 24 hours. Basically looking for a trend or a difference in any of the parameters that we could measure.
Now, we'll get into all the studies we did over the years, uh, but if we were to just fast forward since those first days, roughly how many studies and how many people have been through these fully instrumented studies now?
Yeah, great question. I get asked that all the time. I would say that I've lost count of the number of actual studies we've done. They number somewhere between, I'm going to say, 40 and 100. Literally, we've put out a number of papers out there, and I just don't keep track of them. As far as number of people and number of exposures and number of data points, depends on how you count all of that. I'm going to conservatively estimate that we have about 1,500 subjects, individual subjects that have gone through our studies, but many of those subjects have had numerous data points gathered on them, or they have come back and volunteered for another study. We have people that have come back 3, 4, 5 times even. So the number of individuals is actually lower, but we probably have well over 3,000 data points collected on people at this point. And again, that's over about 2.5 decades now.
And so when people say, this is non-scientific talk, when people say the TASER has not been studied, that's just crazy.
Yeah, I don't think that's not accurate at all. I mean, I have spent my life's work, my career doing that. Again, I'm 2.5 decades into the research of this, so there's been plenty of study of this, and I'm not the only person that
Right.
does this.
Yeah. In fact, let's we'll put up a quick video here just to show how early in our study history was the video we're going to look at here in terms of the setup.
As far as the video that you're showing now, this is actually probably midway through the 2.5 decades or so. Again, fairly rudimentary when we first started. The team that I lead now does a lot of, we've done this so often we're familiar with it. This is just to give you an idea of the machinery, the setup, the precise placement of darts, the exposures. You'll notice that in some of these studies, people are wearing breath-by-breath analyzers because we want to measure their breathing ability. You'll notice people drawing blood. You'll notice ultrasound machines or EKG machines in the background. Lots of things, but we continue to improve upon that process, and I am very fortunate that I have a team that I lead that is very amenable to constant improvement.
Yeah, here we've got looks like EKG leads. What does that do?
Yeah, we're checking heart rhythm and rate. Again, sort of before and after. This is an example of precise manual placement of the darts. So some of our studies involve wanting to know effects based on certain dart placement. And so we want to be very precise about where those go. You'll notice that they're hooked up in the background. You'll see some engineers running our circuitry for us and measuring to make sure that the devices are staying within parameter. The exposure happens, and we have personnel making sure that the person stays on the padded table so that they don't fall off and injure themselves. We also coach the person through the exposure so they understand exactly what is happening. Yeah.
So let's start at the beginning. So early on, you started by testing just 5-second standard TASER duration pulses. And what did your studies find on that?
Yeah, so with that, we really didn't find anything of significance. And so that led to, further discussions about, well, if 5 seconds didn't show us anything, either we're not exposing them long enough or we're maybe not looking at the correct parameters. And so my team and I would sit down and we would talk about different parameters to study, to measure, because maybe we were missing something. We also talked about different confounders to change within there, such as could we change things such as the duration of the exposure, the position of the exposure, whether or not underlying conditions such as intoxication were a factor. So we would change, all of those types of things. And I'll just make it pretty clear that these are all training events that TASER or Axon as the company is hosting. And my team simply comes in there and studies them during their training exposures. We are not de novo dreaming these experiments up. We simply come in and consent people who are already going to take exposures under these conditions.
One of my favorite tests early on was the alcohol exposure. I think that was at a master instructor school in Las Vegas, as luck would have it.
That is correct.
And, it's pretty much what it sounds like. Tell us what we did in that test and why that was relevant.
So at the time, because we had not up to that point found really a clinical difference or clinical significance in any of our measurable parameters, one of the criticisms at the time was that we were simply using healthy young people that were unimpaired, and that is not generally how a TASER device is used in real life. It's usually on somebody who is intoxicated or impaired somehow, and so the thought was maybe we are missing something by not exposing impaired people. And so the company again had a training exposure where people were impaired at the time, and we simply went in to measure based on their impairment. And their impairment levels went up to, I think someone was as high as 0.33, but in general we were shooting,
Which is really
which is
intoxicating. Right?
quite high.
But when you say they were impaired, like how did they get impaired? Now I'm just curious of the setup here.
Yeah, so I think what the company was doing at the time was it was a training class, and after hours, because there was a social event, alcohol was being served, and we simply were monitoring people's alcohol consumption. We were monitoring their, not just their consumption, but also their measured breath analysis, so we could tell approximately what impairment level they were at. And before they had become impaired, they were consented and asked if they.
I was going to say they knew going
Yes,
into
yeah,
this, like, hey, you're going to have some drinks, you're going to
Right. We
get
can't,
impaired, and you're
Yep.
going to go through the testing.
right. We can't consent somebody who's impaired, but
Right.
becoming impaired was part of the consent process.
Were you there, Rick?
I was, yeah. And look, like this was just one of those cases where, as we've dug in, and when Dr. O says they haven't found anything of clinical significance, if I were to describe what I think has happened over the past 20 years that we've been sponsoring research with you, is effectively we haven't seen any significant adverse effect. We've seen some minor effects, and we'll talk about those today. And you've looked at, if we were to just run down the list, so we looked at alcohol impairment, we looked at extended durations, we looked at whether they were breathing or not, you looked at blood acid levels, you looked at
Correct.
what else? Take us down the list.
We've looked at muscle breakdown proteins. We've looked at temperature deviations. In other words, there was a time when it was thought that because a TASER caused your muscles to contract vigorously, much like shivering, that potentially we were raising people's body temperatures to a dangerous level. We were unable to show that. Most recently,
Does it rise?
Yeah, it does not measurably. And we were, it's really interesting technology. We were using the same type of ingested thermometer that athletes use
wow.
to measure internal body temperatures. So these folks would swallow a temperature sensor. As it traverses their GI tract, it's in there for about 72 hours. They have to wear a little belt pack receiver, and about every 15 seconds, this sensor is measuring internal body temperature and basically beaming out temperature to the receiver. So we would have, almost 72 hours of continuous temperature monitoring, and we could timestamp when they would receive their exposure. And then we could tell before and after whether or not they had any temperature rise.
That's pretty cool. So, but there's no measurable rise in temperature, even though your muscles are contracting.
Not from a TASER exposure. We saw temperature rises predictably when they would go work out at the gym and involved in other activities, but not from a TASER.
We don't want to know what the other activities are, Rick.
All right. So one of the early critiques was about extended durations. And how did that come to be a critique? If I recall correctly, it's because we only did a limited number. Well, I'll have you describe.
Yeah, so I think early on, a standard trigger pull on a TASER is 5 seconds in the law enforcement world. So that was what we started our measurements with, was just a 5-second duration. Out of that, again, we were criticized that we only measured 5 seconds. And so since the trigger could be repulled and a longer than 5-second exposure could occur, we decided that we would, if there were training exposures that were longer than 5 seconds, we would do that. The company at the time went out to 10 and 15 and even longer on occasion during their training exposures, and we would measure all of those. But in general, we had the most numbers of 15-second exposures which we could write data upon. And that's how 15 seconds got into the literature early on. I mean, this was probably a decade and a half ago now. And, you know, fortunately or unfortunately, that 15 seconds, everybody sort of locked onto that and just said, since there's nothing out there more than 15 seconds, this is the figure we're going to sort of stick with for policy making, which I don't think is founded on anything other than the fact that we just don't have numbers out there beyond that.
Beyond 15 seconds.
Well, I will add that just recently we have looked at longer duration studies now out to 30 seconds with the new TASER 10 just because of some unique applications.
And what do you see going out to 30 seconds?
Essentially the same as what we saw going out to 5 and 15 seconds with a slightly more elevated creatine kinase, which is a muscle breakdown protein. And that's to be expected because you're basically making the muscle contract for longer periods of time. But the levels of creatine kinase were never elevated to the point of significant concern.
Would these be similar to what you would see if somebody lifted weights?
Yes, going to the gym.
Got it. And so like out to 30 seconds, you're not beginning to see any changes in terms of acidosis or any of the other effects of any significance?
We did not, no. And that paper is being written right now, so I'm sort of, you know, spoiler alert, I'm kind of giving you a little bit of the punchline here. That paper will be coming out shortly.
I remember back in the early 2000s, we had, in one case, you went all the way up to 45 seconds. I think that was on our X-Rep. It's a different product, but same category.
Correct. We do have some cases where, you know, onesies and twosies where we had very prolonged exposures. And again, the findings were, again, very similar, but different product. We never had large numbers of people going through. And, you know, I think we could always be criticized about that, but at some level, you know, you have to kind of draw the line at some point.
I mean, it's not fun to do this. And I think
Right.
you point out going out beyond 15 seconds or 30 seconds, you weren't seeing anything changing.
Correct.
And so why put somebody through it?
Right. I just didn't see I didn't feel like I needed to do that.
And then Rick, maybe, you know, I hope everyone's watched the prior episodes of the Bold to Go podcast where you discuss this, but maybe one, talk about how we landed on 5 seconds, but then two, why this discussion is so important about 10, 15, 30 seconds, a prolonged duration, what that really means on the street if you were to do longer durations.
Yeah. So the original TASER back in the 1970s, it had a momentary trigger, which meant you would press it and it would start the flow of electricity and it would stay on as long as you held the trigger down. And what we learned from use out in the field was that one of the major causes of failure is officers would fire it, and then the natural human reaction, like if you pull the trigger on something, is you then release it.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, there was a study in Vancouver, Canada, where they had a bunch of SWAT trained officers. These are highly trained officers, and about half of them would fire and then release. And then you're basically not delivering any effect. And so having learned that, when we developed these products, our first product was a consumer product, and there we did a 30-second run because the idea was you shouldn't be staying around if you're using a TASER to defend yourself. Drop it, leave it, it'll keep the person down while you leave. And the reason we need to do that is unlike what people see, you know, on television shows or something, when you hit somebody with a TASER, they don't like fall down and go to sleep.
Mm-hmm.
While it's on, their muscles contract, and then when it shuts off, they're right back to normal. And so the fight could continue. But when we went from consumer 30 seconds to police, you know, we talked with various training experts and we settled on 5 seconds as being long enough that you could fire the weapon, orient what's happening. It would, if you got a good connection, the person would go down, and that would give the officer enough time to, again, sort of see what's happening and make a decision whether they had to go longer or not.
Mm-hmm.
And again, one of the common misconceptions on the public is you'll hear, oh, the police tasered him 5 times. And it's said in such a way as like, wow, that sounds abusive. Why did they hit him 5 times? Well, fact is 5 seconds goes by pretty quick, especially if you have somebody who's fighting and resisting getting into handcuffs. And if they can keep fighting normally, you may have to keep the power on longer.
To gain compliance.
To gain compliance. I mean, Dr. Ho, you're a police officer as well. Anything you'd add to that about the...
Not at all. Those situations are very dynamic. You never can tell when somebody is going to comply or not.
So one of the early questions was, what about these extended durations? And so we began testing longer durations, going out with some extended ones at 45 seconds or more. And the point was, even though those weren't repeated with huge numbers of people, you guys weren't seeing anything
Correct.
of any significance.
Correct.
So then one of the questions was, well, what if people couldn't breathe? If you held this down for a really long time, maybe they can't breathe. So how did we test that?
Yeah, so we actually tested that by, if you look back at our breathing paper, I think that was back from the 2007 to 2009 era, that we were very specific about hand placing probes on people in different places, especially encompassing the chest. Specifically because we know that we can control different muscles depending on where those probes are. And so if you put them both in the leg, in general, it's not going to likely affect the chest or the breathing muscles or things like that. So we specifically wanted to try to capture breathing muscles and see if we could affect them. And what we find is that, there's a couple different mechanisms by which people breathe. The muscles, the skeletal muscles around your chest, which a TASER definitely can affect. But you also have a deeper muscle called your diaphragm, which allows you to pull respirations from internal. The TASER does not seem to affect that. We have a couple of studies out there showing that. And so people do continue to breathe during these. What we mostly find is if the exposure time is too short, I think just the simple shock or from the initial TASER being applied, people hold their breath. It's kind of like jumping into a cold lake where it's very uncomfortable and people just sort of bear down and hold their breath. So they don't breathe initially, but once they realize they can breathe, they start to breathe, and they do. And so we see that pretty consistently.
All right. So that was, breathing was one of the first things that we tested. Then when we had Dr. Kroll on, we talked about metabolic acidosis. So let's get your take on what is metabolic acidosis, why is it dangerous, and why is that something we should think about?
Yeah, from an emergency medicine standpoint, metabolic acidosis is a concerning clinical condition that is brought on by exertion. Somebody who's going to the gym and exerting themselves in a controlled setting, and you're taking rest breaks in between your workouts and things like that, you do get acidotic, but then you allow yourself to rest and come back to normal. Somebody who is out of control exerting themselves, such as somebody who's intoxicated or maybe mentally ill and not thinking correctly, what we find is that they are able to continue to exert themselves past the point of the normal cues of exhaustion. So where you and I would be getting tired and feel like we need to take a break and just take a breather for a minute and allow ourselves to recover, people like that may not, and they oftentimes will continue whatever exertional activity they're doing in public, which brings the attention of usually the police. And usually there's some type of a resistive altercation that happens. And when they continue to resist, unfortunately, the waste products from their exertion build up, and their metabolic acidosis condition becomes much worse. And at some level, we believe that it can get so bad that they can actually literally exhaust themselves to death by being too profoundly in metabolic acidosis. So that's why it becomes a concern in the medical arena, especially the emergency medicine and public safety arenas.
When you say they continue fighting, is that drugs, alcohol, everything combined, mental health?
Could be all of the above. Again, it's
Someone in crisis.
It's somebody in crisis. I think people who are not intoxicated, aren't in a mental health crisis, when you get tired, you give up. You can be very angry about something, but at some point, if you are of normal mental state, you'll give up just because you're so exhausted you can't go on. People who are impaired, intoxicated, maybe manic or off their meds or something like that, may not be able to feel or pay attention to those same cues of exhaustion that a normal-headed person would. And so the fear there is that they will continue to fight and resist. Their acidosis level will become much worse, and they will actually exhaust themselves into a cardiopulmonary arrest situation.
Now, there are some areas in medicine that are controversial. This is not one, correct? The metabolic acidosis, if your blood pH drops too low, it will kill you. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct, and I think there's also a time component in there. So if your blood pH drops low, if it happens over the course of many hours or days, which you can sometimes see in people who are very sick from things like infections or metabolic processes, your body can tolerate metabolic acidosis that comes on in a very slow fashion like that. It doesn't tolerate it if it comes on within seconds or minutes. So again, somebody who's completely at rest, but then suddenly exerting themselves to a maximal amount over the course of just a couple of minutes can throw themselves into such a metabolic acidosis crisis that the levels become so profound that you can get very sick very quickly.
And you can measure that, I would assume, in the autopsy.
You cannot,
You cannot.
actually, unfortunately. So that is a measurement that occurs in real time as long as you are alive.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, after you die, because your metabolic processes stop, everything, to sort of simplify it, becomes abnormal at that point, and it's impossible to know at what level you were at when you died.
Is that because some of your cells are still metabolizing, and so pretty much everybody becomes acidotic after they?
Yeah,
They die?
it's actually because your cells are not metabolizing at that point. In other words, one of the ways that you buffer this acidosis is by being able to breathe correctly. If I breathe faster, I can blow off more carbon dioxide, which is a acid in your body, and that helps to buffer your pH system. And so if I take away your ability of breathing, which, essentially if you're dead and not breathing, your acidosis gets worse much quickly and it's artificially bad.
All right. So one of the ways, or one of the places I really got interested in this topic is there was a case around 2006 or so in Northern California. It involved a man named Heston. I can't remember his first name, and he had died in police custody. He had an 18-year methamphetamine addiction. It was a really sad case. Police had been to his house on numerous occasions. Extremely violent outburst. And the thesis of the plaintiffs that were suing us and the police actually agreed with all this. They said metabolic acidosis is likely what killed him. He was exerting himself. He was in a frail state from all the drug use. But their argument was that he'd exerted himself right to the edge, and then the taser pushed him off the cliff, was how they described it. That the little bit of muscle activity from the taser was the final piece that it introduced enough acidosis to cause him to die. And so we went after that. That was the first lawsuit we lost. We ultimately won it effectively on appeal. But this was really the first time we'd heard this argument, which is actually really interesting because a lot of these plaintiffs' attorneys will come out and tell you that they're trying to do the public good. But in fact, they totally blindsided us. They'd never brought this up as a theory until the courtroom. It was really a sort of a gotcha moment. And so afterwards, we called up Dr. Ho and we said, hey, we should really study this, but not in a vacuum, sort of, because the idea with the taser isn't that it's this or they're sitting in the chair doing nothing. We needed a comparison of the taser to other force options. And then we also asked you about what else besides acidosis you'd be worried about. And you brought up this idea of catecholamine. So maybe I'll turn over to you to tell us about how we approach this.
Yeah. So just a little bit about catecholamines. So acidosis is one physiologic mechanism that is concerning. Catecholamines, which is they're chemicals in your body that are essentially like adrenaline. You produce them when you're under significant stress. It is felt that if you can produce too many catecholamines, you could potentially throw yourself also into a cardiac arrest. We do know that to be true because if I were to inject you with just pure epinephrine into a vein, I could cause you to cardiac arrest. It's kind of a dangerous thing. And so the thought is that can you actually stress yourself out to the point of creating so much catecholamine surge internally on yourself that you are causing harm to your body? So those are really the two concepts, acidosis and catecholamine surge, that would be concerning to us. And so I remember when we discussed this with both you and my research team, it was fascinating for us to think about how we would try to measure these. And the thought occurred to us that many weeks there are training courses for police recruits, retraining courses annually for police officers, where they are doing things like defensive tactics, exertional work, spraying each other with pepper spray, fighting the police dog.
The fun stuff.
Yeah, all the stuff that people do regularly in training. And all of those things are the things that people do with the police
Mhm.
when they have these types of bad outcomes. And so we simply got ourselves permission to work with some training classes, observe their folks going through some of these activities. And again, we started measuring their acidosis levels before and after, as well as their catecholamine levels before and after.
Yeah, so let's go through specifically. So what were the activities you guys tested?
Yeah, so there were, in this, we broke it out into 5 different arms that we were studying. The volunteers in these studies did not go through all 5 of them for study. We only studied them in one arm each. The arms were defensive tactics work, or basically physical resistance type of work.
So like wrestling.
Wrestling. Sprinting was another one. So there was a 100-yard sprint it was sort of an obstacle course and a jump over a 4-foot wall. That simulated sort of chasing a suspect or running after somebody on a foot chase. There was one where the person would run from a police dog for approximately 20 seconds. The dog would catch up to them. The dog would get on the bite with them, and they would have to wrestle with the dog while the dog was biting them, basically.
Oh, here comes
I'm
the
actually
dog.
showing the video
Yeah.
here of a guy.
Oh. Oh,
Yeah, and so essentially what we're trying to show here is, or trying to examine here is, first of all, the person who is the volunteer is going to be somewhat tired or exerted from running a little bit. And then they're going to get even more so when they're fighting with the dog. And the dog was allowed to fight with them for approximately 20 to 30 seconds.
I'd probably be a little stressed just knowing that dog was coming too.
Yeah, and then we would be able to measure before and after things like stress hormone, catecholamines, acidosis. I don't know if I measured pepper spray, or I don't know if I mentioned pepper spray. That was a 4th arm, and a 5th arm was TASER exposure. So those are all very common things that happen with law enforcement interactions with subjects in the field.
Yeah, I'm going to show this one here. When they were hitting the heavy bag, I was surprised at just how acidotic they became. So,
And I would agree. So this was designed to show basically just heavy physical resistance. We simply wanted to determine whether or not doing something like this would ramp up their catecholamine levels or their acidosis levels. The time frame that they did this for was only 45 seconds, so this was not a long test, but it was very exhausting for them. And in fact, the heavy resistance arm here showed the greatest acidosis increase, if you will.
This one did.
This one did for sure. Followed shortly by the sprint or the foot chase one.
First of all, 45 seconds hitting that heavy bag is a long time. And it's simulating that you're getting into a fight. I don't think, a lot of people may realize if there's a scuffle on the street and you're a deputy or officer or trooper rolling around with somebody, 45 seconds is a long time. A minute and a half, that is a long time to be in a fight with a suspect.
I think that's a great observation. However, I don't know that I had thought about it that way until we were in the middle of this and watching people get very, very acidotic doing this for 45 seconds.
Yeah.
And then you sort of compare that with, and I think anybody who's watching the show that works in law enforcement would tell you that most scuffles of that magnitude don't last 45 seconds. No, they last much longer than that. It's usually several minutes because they're calling for help and assistance, and it takes a while for backup to get there and that sort of thing. And so it gives you some good insight as to why some of these collapses happen in the field, because people who are impaired are continuing this type of activity for much longer than 45 seconds. They get much, much sicker than we were able to show in any of these studies. And we got some people pretty sick.
In fact, let's talk about those results. What did you find in terms of the relative levels of acidosis?
Yeah. Well, so each of those lines that you are showing right there represents acidosis levels or pH levels. The lower your pH level goes, the more acidotic you become. That's sort of an inverse relationship. And we all start at about 7.4 at rest. So if I were to check all of us in this room right now, we would be approximately 7.4 pH. We're not really exerting ourselves. If we were to go and punch the heavy bag for 45 seconds, your curve would look something like that bottom dotted line there. It drops very quickly. It drops to the lowest point, and that became the most dangerous arm in the study from a physiology standpoint, which sort of proves the point that people who are resisting and in these heavy altercations for longer than that time period get very, very sick very quickly.
And so these guys that are on drugs that are fighting with police and they go for many minutes and they're showing no signs of exhaustion, you think they may be pushing themselves even lower than the volunteers in your study?
I guarantee you that they are. In fact, there's papers out there that actually show that.
And you were sharing with me that some of the people in your study, what sort of things did you see just with these healthy people punching a bag for 45 seconds?
Yeah, we had many of them, probably half the group were vomiting afterwards, and at least two of them had a syncopal episode where, which means they fainted afterwards because their pH got so low.
Wow.
Yeah.
And again, for those who can't see it online, what we're showing here is a chart of pH over time, starting from the beginning. And then you see that dotted line that just goes straight down. And that is immediately after the 45 seconds. And then you can see over the course of 30 minutes how long it takes people to recover. And that heavy bag, man, that just, oh, no, I'm sorry, that's 10 minutes.
And what'd you say just a few seconds ago? Like if you just tested us now, we're not exerting anything, we're sitting here, where would we?
We would be at about 7.4, which is where all of those lines
Right.
start. Yep. And I think also, to make the point that I said earlier, there is a time component in this. So again, if you drop your pH over many minutes to hours, you tolerate that much better. But if you look on this chart, it drops very quickly, and it's because of that one activity that they were doing. The second worst line would be the solid blue line there would be the sprint line. And then the third worst line there would be the dog bite line. So running from the dog and then fighting with the dog. Green dotted line is taser exposure, which, the drop there is between 7.4 and 7.3, which in our world is pretty negligible. So even though it shows a drop on the chart, I would argue that that's tolerated very well. And then the orange line, or the top line, which really doesn't change at all, is pepper spray. And that's to be expected because pepper spray it's not exertional.
Right.
It's irritating, it's painful.
Painful,
Yeah,
for sure.
It'll make your stress hormones go up, but it won't make you acidotic.
So you weren't surprised by pepper spray?
Not really. We put that in there more as a comparison.
And you were telling us earlier that you've now gone out to much longer durations, 30 seconds and more. And do you see any more pH drop with the taser? Does it start to come down like the Sprint or the other ones?
No, it does not. So we have not seen a change off that line that you just showed.
And then I seem to recall from one of these tests, you'd done a 15-second taser duration, and then you compared it to the acidosis from other activities. And I recall it's about the equivalent of going up 2 flights of stairs. Do I remember that right?
Yeah, so we've actually had a couple of papers where what we wanted to do in those was to compare whether or not the taser exposure could somehow be measured as above and beyond what exhaustion could get you to. And that really goes to your point of, could the taser have sort of been the thing that pushed a person off the cliff, if you will. We have 2 papers out there that show we were unable to determine that. I mean, we couldn't measure it. So what we find is that the taser does not make you acidotic any differently than physical exertion, and it certainly doesn't make it measurably more so than exertion. We were unable to detect that.
So put simply, if somebody is resisting and the choice is to use a taser that might get them under control quickly or continue a fight that's going to potentially go through a protracted period of time, which of those is more dangerous in your estimation?
Letting continued physical activity go unabated is the most dangerous thing, period. So anything that gets the person to stop that type of, uncontrolled, agitated physical exertion is what needs to happen, along with recognition that this is a medical emergency and that this person needs to go to a hospital. They need to be put under professional medical care as soon as possible.
That's why this duration discussion is such a big deal. Whether it's 5 seconds, 15 seconds, 30 seconds, whether to get the person under control and restrained to prevent some bad things from happening.
Yes, I would say whatever mechanism you have available to you that will allow you to make that happen quickly, that's what needs to happen.
But I think it is also important to set context. If you're a law enforcement officer who are watching this, we are not saying you can just stay on the trigger indefinitely. You need to have a plan. The taser needs to be part of a plan to get somebody under control. And it is uncomfortable. It is stressful. You should not continue it more than needed. However, there's not an arbitrary cutoff at which point we say, well, now you have to stop and go to another force option, because what we can see, just about every other force option, if it involves physical struggle, is going to be more harmful to people in this state than the taser.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
All right, so let's pivot now. We started with acidosis. Let's now talk about catecholamines, and tell us what your research showed there.
Yeah, so I already explained what catecholamines were, what the concern about those were, and this chart, the research basically dovetails nicely with what we saw with acidosis. Again, the highest rise in catecholamines could be considered harmful, and where we saw that highest rise was the defensive tactics heavy bag resistance work. So heavy physical exertion is what causes your catecholamines to surge and rise the highest, followed by, again, everything in that exact same sequence, followed by the foot chase or the run, followed by the dog bite. In the last two places, the taser and the OC spray changed places, and this is very predictable because you get a little bit of a rise with taser exposure because of the pain, I think, associated with that. You also get a little bit of a rise with OC spray because of the pain associated with that, but the OC spray line then continues to rise after that because there is continued pain associated with that for a prolonged period of time, whereas the taser line drops off pretty quickly because once it's off, it's no longer painful.
So whether we're talking about the stress hormones, the catecholamines, or metabolic acidosis, the general result here seems to be pepper spray and taser are going to be less stressful on the body than extreme physical exertion, fighting, or somebody running from the police. Does that sort of encapsulate it?
I think that's a good summary of that. That's how I would interpret that.
All right, so let's come back now. What other areas of testing have we not really talked about that might be of interest to folks?
Oh, that's a good question. Let's see. Over the years, we have done some very interesting testing in the neurocognitive area. And this was to combat a couple of cases that had come out that we had seen where attorneys were making claims that a person subjected to a taser exposure was unable to understand things like a Miranda advisement. And so we actually did some studies around that, again, using this very same methodology of these 5 arms of stressful events, and then doing things like measuring their cognitive ability. And what we found was that in all of these stressful arms, people had an immediate, when I say immediate, for about 15 minutes to 60 minutes of some decreasing cognitive abilities, not to the point where you couldn't understand anything, but they were a little bit slower on things like executive functioning and that sort of thing and reasoning, but it wasn't completely absent. And then it all sort of returned to normal after approximately 1 hour. So we didn't find that any of those, including a taser exposure, was significantly debilitating as far as Miranda advisements. We also did that very same type of thing with standardized field sobriety testing. There was a case out of New York that the person was pulled over for DUI, ran from the police, was subdued by a taser, and then was subjected to a standardized field sobriety test. And the defense was that they couldn't pass the test because of the taser exposure, and we've sort of debunked that. So those were two other areas that we specifically were looking at. Most recently, we have done some flammability studies. We do know that in some of the older models of tasers that cause external arcing, those are sources of ignition in very flammable environments. Interestingly enough, we just got done testing TASER 10 circuits in the exact same flammability types of environments, and including enhanced flammability environments where we would use gasoline on the target, and we were unable to get ignition under any circumstance, including super oxygenated environments with gasoline and that sort of thing.
Wow.
Yeah, I think that's important to know, and that, I think, is because of the lower voltage of TASER 10. It just doesn't seem to have that sparking ability, which is by purposeful design, but that actually enhances the safety in those environments as well.
Well, yeah, when we went over the numbers with Dr. Kroll, all in, if I remember correctly, it was around 30 or 40 fatalities, including falls and flammables. I think flammables were about 25% of those.
Right.
And so, yeah, the TASER 10, glad to hear. I hadn't actually talked to you about those results, but we designed it so that it would not ignite things, and looks like it worked.
Good design.
Yeah. Hey, let's come back to over the years, some people have criticized our testing and frankly criticized your testing because the company sponsors much of it. But then they'll point out, well, there was only one time ever that a human being where we found any sort of cardiac effect, and it was in your testing. So tell us about that.
Yeah, so that, I don't remember the year exactly. It might have been around 2012 or so. There was a product coming online called the X3. It was a 3-shot weapon that we were, just a little background about the testing that we do. The testing that I've been involved in has gotten to the point, even back then, where it's sort of a 4-pronged, phase-gated process where any new weapons need to go through this process and pass each of those on a go, no-go basis before they will be allowed to be released in public. The X3 at the time was undergoing that testing. What we found was that we were able to cause what was called cardiac capture in one of our human subjects. That's obviously very concerning. It's not lethal, but it shows that the device is putting out enough energy to potentially reach the heart on somebody who is, of a certain body habitus. And so we studied that case quite vigorously, and we went back and advised the company about that. The company went back with its engineers and did some further testing and modifications to that device. We then retested it under the same circumstances. We're unable to find the similar results.
So when you're talking about cardiac capture, as I understand it, this was, when you think about the heart muscle, if it doesn't detect anything, there's no detectable change. And then capture is where you start to, this is how pacemaker works, right? That you can begin to pace the heart. It will sense something and it'll start to change its heartbeat to perhaps be captured by that pulse and start to follow it. It's my understanding that's generally far below the level that causes dangerous effects like ventricular fibrillation, but it is a sign that, hey, you're now getting into a level where the heart is starting to sense the electricity, which was made that concerning. And we went back and did a, kind of a full design review and redesigned the system to bring some of the power down, and then had it retested.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, to make it rudimentary, the heart has a native pacemaker. It beats all on its own, regardless of anything else external that it's being subjected to. In the case of a capture, it is receiving electrical input from an external source, in this case the X3, which causes extra beats in it. So it's receiving that, and it's actually beating more than its native pacemaker. That is much different than an interruption of its electrical system, which would be the case in something, as you've mentioned, ventricular fibrillation, which would be a cardiac arrest state. That is, very, very dangerous. In both cases, the heart is receiving electricity, but it's in much different magnitudes in different ways, and the effects are quite different.
Now, when we were talking about this earlier, because we changed the product and then retested it and had no effects, some people might say, well, you don't need to publish the result because it's not on the tested product. But
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important point. So, my affiliation with the company has always been, first of all, I'm not an employee of the company. I'm a contractor. The reason I am remaining a contractor is because I don't want to be subject to employee, the same rules that an employee would have. The agreement that I have with the people that I sort of check in with here at the company has always been that no matter what the results are of these tests, we publish those. That's been the goal from day one, and we haven't withheld any data. And I think that's a really good example of here we have a case that is potentially a negative. We could have easily, on redesign, just not published it. I felt the need to put that out there. I basically don't hide data from anybody. So, and the company knows that.
yeah. Well, we didn't want you to either. I mean, this is a case where, if we learn of any new risks, we'll warn of them. We do this testing exactly so that we can try to make it as safe as possible. Our goal with each level, each new product, is to make it a little bit more effective and make sure it doesn't become any more risky or any more dangerous. And this testing has been really instrumental. Again, we've now put thousands of people through this testing, and I'm really proud to have a relationship with you. And I think this is probably the most tested weapon anywhere in the world. And I think your lab has done more of that testing than anybody else.
I would agree with that. Yeah. Thanks for the
And
opportunity.
and you learned something new tonight. You took flammables off the table. You thought that with TASER 10 but now you have, this is the first time you heard that they've done the study on it.
Yeah, it was the first time I'd heard the final results. We had tested it in the lab, but it's one thing for us testing it in the engineering lab.
But
Dr. Ho and his team take it out and they test it, in real world conditions and from sort of an adversarial bent to see if it holds up. Before we came in tonight, I want to share one last little thing. We actually had Kool-Aid, who is one of our aides who works on this show, go out and print up all the studies of TASER devices. And then we bound them and put them in big binders and took them up in my office. And I just want to share this little moment with Dr. Ho as we kind of celebrated all the work that he's done, among others. I mean, there's many other labs that have published, whether the Ministry of Defense in the UK or others. But again, you guys are the most prolific. All right, Dr. Ho, I think we've got over 100 peer-reviewed studies, and then we've printed out over 1,000 scientific papers and studies of various backgrounds.
Definitely something to be proud of. 2.5 decades of work.
Yeah. And then we did crack open one of these binders. Anybody who wants to come read them, you can come to Axon headquarters and we'll have them all printed out for you. So just putting it all together, there's all the field studies that show an injury rate that's extremely low, something like 3 injuries per 1,000. Those are typically done, I think, by other groups that are analyzing police data. And then your group has primarily looked at prospective studies of human volunteers that are scientifically instrumented. I mean, actually, one that we didn't even talk about, I think you guys invented this technique, didn't you, of using an electrocardiogram to be able to actually watch the heart functioning?
Yeah, so I'll give credit to one of my colleagues on that, who's an ultrasound expert. We were using ultrasound to watch the heart in real time during TASER exposures on many of our initial volunteers, and that was basically our best way to monitor whether or not we were having any sort of cardiac activity or not.
And that's
interference.
because the electrical leads on an ECG, when the taser's pulsing, you really can't see the heartbeat because the taser's.
Right. There's
you
so
know.
much electrical artifact override from the taser that you can't interpret that.
And that was fantastic that you guys were able to actually physically watch the heart beating to detect, in that case, the shift in the heartbeat that then caused us to go hit pause and go back and modify the weapon before we released it.
I'll give a shout out to my colleague Rob Reardon at Hennepin County, who for that he's a ultrasound guru.
Well, Dr. O, it's been a long and fruitful relationship. I think you're really helping us to make tasers more effective, making sure they stay just as safe, or in this case, safer when we eliminate some of those risks. And we're really excited to see what happens over the next 10 years. I know you're going to be involved in a lot of the testing around the new Apollo Dart.
Appreciate that. It's always been the goal to make these as safe as humanly possible.
And Rick, before we go though, if you're, which you're not, but an outside observer, and you watched episode 9 or listened to episode 9 with Dr. Mark Kroll, and now you just listened to this, Dr. Jeffrey Ho. I mean, there's no way you walk away from those 2 episodes not thinking how grounded in science TASER has been, and the hundreds of peer-reviewed studies that are out there. Like, it's just, I mean, it hurts me now to think about the criticisms that come our way based on just what I've learned in the past 2 episodes.
Well, look, unfortunately, we live in a world where people can cling to their beliefs regardless of the facts or what the science says. And this is an area where it's highly politicized. And unfortunately, there are people that just don't trust the police. They don't trust corporations, or they, don't trust science. They want to trust their own personal feelings. And I think that's what we run up to a lot. But in any case that somebody has brought forth a valid scientific argument, we've done our best to go test. I mean, one we didn't talk about today was on the topic of cocaine interactions. Would cocaine make the heart more susceptible to electrical stimulation? And in fact, that was not something we legally or ethically could do on people. So there we went to the Cleveland Heart Clinic, famous heart hospital, and researchers there did the testing and again found similar results, that there was no discernible effect on the heart, even on pigs that were being injected with high levels of cocaine.
Actually, it made it more difficult to have a cardiac effect from a taser on the heart, which makes sense because cocaine is a membrane stabilizer when it comes to cardiac activity, very much like it's affiliated with cardiac lidocaine. We use that in cardiac arrest for the exact same purpose. And so in that case, it actually showed that cocaine, in trying to induce a cardiac arrest, was somewhat cardioprotective.
Now, I just want to be clear, you are not recommending
No.
that patients go do some coke if they're going to have a run-in with the police.
Not at all, but that was, it's an ironic conclusion, but I am not recommending that.
Sorry for a little humor here. But,
Well, I thought you were going to tell the story about being in a Vegas, conference room. No, okay.
No, not at all.
Well, I think that's a wrap on episode 10 of Boldly Go Podcast. You can find us on YouTube, Apple Podcast, and Spotify. We hope you subscribe, and then you'll be notified when we drop episode, and we are dropping episodes every Friday. And if you want to follow us, you can follow me on X at Mike Wagers. You can follow Rick on X at Axon Rick. If you follow us and interact with us, you can ask us questions, and maybe we will read one of those questions on the air, which reminds me, Rick, we didn't do an AMA this time. We will save it for next time. But with that, I think we should call this a night.
hey, it's a wrap.
It's a
All right.
wrap. Thank you,
Thanks,
Dr.
Dr.
Ho.
Thanks, guys.
Rethink the final frontier, where science meets justice. Let's boldly go. It's the lab where courage meets science, where limits shatter as science sticks. Every test, every pulse, lives protected with clear results.